Okay, number one, thank you very much, Bob, for your kind words. Before I start, good morning, first of all. 4 days ago, I've been visiting Frankl, and I'm really here to give all of you heartily greetings and blessings to you. That's what she said. So after this introduction as a genius, I can only lose my image now, but I should stop right now. I'll try to go on. So my talk is on some recent trends in the cognitive neurosciences and how they relate to Viktor Frankl and logotherapy. And I should start with something which is not so much neuroscience, but philosophy. As we know, as you know, in 1939, Frankl was starting to look at the intersection between philosophy, psychology, and then later on to neuroscience. And he was trying to discover what he calls the border country between philosophy and psychology. How this relates to cognitive neuroscience we'll discover soon. There's one book Frankl wrote which hasn't been translated into English. It's called Unconditional Man, which is very similar to what Bob is living and he was talking about, the spirit we are vis-a-vis mind and body which we do have and which we might lose to a certain extent, or with death totally lose. Now, with this book, Unconditional Man, Frankl sparked a revolution in psychology and in philosophy, insofar as he was no longer only talking about what do we want, in other words, do we have meaning orientation, lust orientation, or power orientation, but the real question is, who are we? What do we consist of? What is our structure? Yeah? And logotherapy, when it was finally coined, came with a twofold revolution. Number one was we do have freedom of the will. Number two, we have a will to meaning. And both of these stood and still stand in stark contrast to a number of theories, actually to all theories, by then and today circulating in psychology, in neuroscience, and so on. So you have here Frankl's nous, the spirit, the spiritual person which we are, yeah, vis-a-vis libido, self-esteem, and all these different motivational moments we do have. Yeah. At the same time, to know what we want is one thing. To know that we have, to be more precise, that we are freedom is yet another thing. And it's a grave challenge to science and to philosophy and also to logotherapy, yeah, because we are challenged by these cognitive neurosciences and so on. Now, as Bob said, I'm doing the archives, and we are also in Vienna. We are editing the collected works of Viktor Frankl, which is going to be a 14-volume set of published and unpublished papers, letters, and personal articles, and so on. And a while ago, I went through these, I don't know how many thousands of pages of literature, yeah, and something dawned on me that if you look through the history of ideas in logotherapy, some of you might think, and I thought so for a long time as well, that Frankl tends to repeat himself. I mean, I think it's no offense if I say so, to having read one book comes close to having read 3 books, because sometimes he recycles ideas, yeah? And yet, if you look carefully at the publication dates, yeah, you'll find out that Frankl very often responded to certain trends and topics in psychology, in the behavioral sciences. And if you go through this, I try to coin this, it's a bit broad, but still you'll find this trend, yeah? In the early publications from 25, when he still was an Adlerian, to 42, when his career stopped for a while because he was deported, you see him challenging pure psychodynamics. In other words, psychoanalysis and individual psychology, and different schools and different schools within these two. Yeah. From 1945 to 1955, especially, he was trying to discuss and finding, criticizing collectivisms, which of course by then history had showed us, given us a lesson how costly they are, and biologism. From the 1950s on, it's mainly behaviorism to the 1970s. In the 1970s, especially in America, and there especially in California, transpersonalism became en vogue, yeah? And from 1985 to his death, psychologism. Now, again, this is very broad, but if you look through the works and if you look at publication dates, when that paper was written, yeah, to discover this trajectory. Yeah? Now, this gives us a lesson also for today, because logotherapy, at least it's my impression, grew with its opponents. Yeah? Frankl replied to certain transcendent topics, and by replying, he discovered new properties of the spiritual person within us, and so on and so forth. Do you get what I'm saying? Does it make sense? If not, please raise your finger. My wife always tells me I talk too fast, and I think too many people know what I'm talking about. So if not, then please raise your hands, and I don't mind asking questions. Okay. Good. Now, these are theories. Oops. What happened now? Okay, all of you are awake now. Sorry for this. And shock therapy. Okay. Okay, these are theories, and it's important to know that they are based on data which are very valid. I mean, that we do have learning histories, and that they, to a certain extent, shape our minds is obvious. That there's psychodynamics going on in our minds also should be clear. The only problem arises when these theories are put forward as complete theories of mankind, of the human mind. In other words, it's the nothing but reductionism which is the challenge. Yeah? Now, if you look at the different causes, these different schools of thought propose as being our main determining factors, you see that for psychodynamics, and I think you know this anyway, it's our individual past. For biology, it's the collective past. I mean, mankind is such, and evolution and so on. For behaviorism, it's the environment, the stimuli which are somehow shaping us, our learning histories. For transpersonalism, now it comes with a certain idea of freedom. The freedom really is a freedom how I feel. In other words, it's very, very subjective, and there's really no open door to meaning. As I think it was Peirce saying, if I think that I look out of the window to the world, in reality I'm looking into a mirror. Then you have the idea that really the human mind is a closed system and mainly concerned with how it feels, yeah? Which connects transpersonalism very deeply to psychoanalysis and psychodynamics. Yeah? It's how I feel. Yeah? Reasons might be different according to both schools, but the basic mechanic is the same. Yeah? And from 1985 to 1997, it was really the self. So how do I feel? It was really, in a nutshell, how do I feel? And if you look at self-help books from this time, it's mainly on positive thinking, the idea that you can have good feelings without a good reason, actually, yeah? Because you just tell yourself that you feel good, and so on and so forth. Paul Witz, and I don't know whether he ever contacted this institute of NYU, wrote this wonderful book, The Religion of Psychology, the Cult of the Self. Yeah? Meaning the egocentrism coming with contemporary psychologies. Now, if you look at these factors, I think all of them do really indeed condition us to a certain extent. Yeah? But if you look at the theories behind them, and even at the findings backing up the theories, yeah, it looks as if all these factors do very much impact us to such an extent that they explain more than we are. Yeah? And this is, in causality theory, you call this the overdetermination problem. Yeah? I'm going to explain what this means in a second. If you take another example, intelligence. Not as complex as existential issues in psychology, but still complex enough. Yeah? There's a very old debate in psychology about intelligence, whether it's nature or nurture. In other words, whether you are born with certain cognitive abilities, or whether how you've been brought up, trained, and so on, makes you more intelligent or less intelligent. Yeah? If you look at studies backing up both theories, you'll find good data on both accounts. Now, on the one hand, you have genetic studies, mainly coming from Thomas Bouchard in Minnesota. And what you study, for example, is taking monozygotic twins who share about 99% of genetic material. 1% is always chaotic. And they were reared apart. In other words, they were adopted as children, and they grew up in very different families, different social environments, and so on. And you look how much intelligence they share when they are somehow matched. Yeah. Also, you can look more fine-grained into molecular genetics. In other words, you'll find much material, many data, which do suggest that intelligence to a high degree is inherited. Yeah? At the same time, and yet, as always in psychology, and yet, if you look at social studies, support programs, cognitive training, adoption studies once again, yeah, you see that the environment, nurture, has a huge impact on intelligence. Yeah? So in the end, you explain more than you need to explain, and this adds up to this. If you summarize different studies, yeah, this is called overdetermination. So because you can explain 142%, but you just have 100% intelligence to explain. Yeah. Okay, you understood this so far. I think 2 to 3 years ago, my wife and me we visited Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and so on, and there I found a very nice idea on how to explain to my students what overdetermination is. Yeah, we were almost in the desert and found this. And I think this is a good example of overdetermination when you have too many calling factors, yeah, and they hide the phenomenon you try to explain. In this case, the bus. Yeah. But it's very similar if you look at these many different theories put forth for the past almost 100 years. To explain how we function, who we are. Yeah? And of course, in the 1990s, for a good reason, because this was declared the decade of the brain by the World Congress, many psychologists started to see that perhaps we explain too much, or perhaps we need less to explain more. Yeah? Which is a very good scientific principle. Yeah? You don't have too many variables, but explain much with little. Now, and the idea was, in physics, there's something called the big toe, theory of everything. And the idea was maybe it's possible to find something similar in psychology, especially in neuropsychology. And this adds up to where we are today, to the idea that actually, if you look at our individual past, it's the learning history of the human brain. If you look at the collective past, it's the evolution of the human brain. Environment means certain stimuli enter your brain, not the brain as such, but certain modules in your brain, and they shape how the brain functions, and information processing. In other words, and feeling is happening in the limbic system and other systems. In other words, you could reduce, in principle, yeah, and this is the idea in modern psychology, cognitive neuroscience especially, maybe you can reduce all of these different factors to one factor. Yeah? In other words, you could reduce it to neurophysiology. Yeah? Now, so far, we wouldn't mind. Yeah? The problem maybe is that even what we call the noetic person, yeah, self-control, freedom of the will, or at least sense of freedom of the will, is also reducible to a special area or some special areas in the brain. The most likely candidate discussed in literature and in journals is the frontal cortex, which is a very recent addition in evolutionary speaking, and which might make us human, who knows. And if you look at this from the perspective of the history of ideas, it's interesting. If you look at it from the perspective of who we might be given this, yeah, the result would come like this. This is Francis Crick of Crick and Watson, the discoverer of the double helix, who wrote this book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. And in it, the astonishing hypothesis is this: you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will, in other words, now we are reaching the genetic core, the spirit core, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You are nothing but a pack of neurons. And this is in his book. I mean, and it's not the only one. There are many, many different authors like Dennett, and some of you might know. I wrote a couple of quotes. I won't read all of them at least. But it even enters, for example, in the just recently published textbook of social cognitive neuroscience. It says that we are nothing but complex biological machines, that the idea of the soul really will die out in the next 10 years, and so on and so forth. Now, when these people talk about the soul, what they really mean is what we call who we are, in other words, the spirit person, the noetic person. Yeah? Do you follow what I'm saying? Good. Now, here comes an interesting point. For the first time in approximately 150 years, William James started psychology in America, Wilhelm Wundt did so in Germany, for Europe. For the first time in these years, the behavioral sciences not only tell us how we function, what makes us tick, and so on, how we are conditioned, but also who we are. So it's no longer the mechanics of the mind, how feelings and thought and action relate, but who we really are. And the answer is nothing but a physiological organism. In which case, if we lose our bodies, we lose everything, because we lose who we are as well. So you see that there is a challenge going on, and the challenge no longer happens only in the ivory tower of psychology, cognitive neuroscience, even in Wall Street Journal, even in Forbes. You find in Forbes there's just been recently an article called "Sorry, but your soul just died," referring to these to the new image of man offered by the cognitive neurosciences. Okay. I'll skip this. So, if we keep up, because Frankl is no longer around and we have some responsibility to keep or to look at the validity of logotherapy, enter this debate open. There's a new empirical challenge. It's no longer Freud, because Freud isn't taken very seriously. I think Freud bashing is also very fashionable in the States. It is very fashionable in Europe, especially in Vienna, where I come from. But here's a challenge, and we need to take this challenge. How do you say? Take up the challenge? Face the challenge? Right. And I think it no longer suffices to say that yes, there's philosophy involved, existentialism involved, but if we have hard data, in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, it won't matter if we say yes, but it feels differently, or here are some theoretical arguments why it's unlikely, because in the end, data is what counts, and data is also what counted for Viktor Frankl, I should say, Now, logotherapists always had a certain talent for going into debate, not only Frankl, and I'd like to point out this article, which I think is unjustly forgotten in our community. In 1964, at the heydays of behaviorism in psychology, Trumbull Mahalik published this brilliant paper, and it's wonderful from its title, an experimental study in existentialism. It's on the concept of neurogenic growth, published in the Journal of Clinical Psychology. Now, the combination of experimental and existential, you'll find so rarely. It's so courageous to publish such a paper, and it's almost poetic for a scientific paper, as a title. Now, logotherapy is a continuing evolution against reductionism. Now, let's look how we could cope with these new findings, or maybe in the end they might show something which we said all along. Maybe I should add anecdotally how I came into this field. I'm teaching cognitive science at Vienna University. This is one thing. But my teacher, Elizabeth Lucas, and I'm in close contact to her, I showed her my tabulation on the different histories of ideas in Frankl's work, and I told her, who's taking up the challenge of the neurosciences, And Lucas' answer was, it's not who is going to take it, it's when will you do it. So anyway, so that's okay. So we know this is similar to what Bob was just showing you, the diagram, We, according to logotherapy, and I think you will know this, I just repeat it very, very briefly, because time is running anyway. Frankl proposes that mental events, like mind events, thought processes, feelings, and so on, and physical events, being brain events, are closely correlated, psychophysical, and they do exist vis-a-vis these exist the noetic person, which again is who we are vis-a-vis what we have. Now, if you would like to study, if you say that there is a noetic person, it's not enough that it just exists. It also needs to express itself. Otherwise, we would be just very spiritual, but nothing would make it. We would be spiritual animals, so to speak. Yeah? But the main idea of logotherapy is that we also can do something by being spirit persons. Yeah? So the idea is, according to logotherapy, that the neurotic person constantly, every minute, every second, every nanosecond, somehow expresses itself. Yeah? Affects our behavior because it affects our choices, because it is the one who makes the choices, and so on and so forth. Yeah? Now, if you would like to study, if you would like to find empirical evidence for the spiritual person, yeah, you can't look at something which is very hard, which is not material, because Frankl, in his 10 theses on the person, there's a very strange sentence. He says, the spiritual person is not a substance in the usual sense. Yeah? A substance, philosophically speaking, is something which exists. Yeah? So not in the usual sense. It's hard to say what he really meant, but he definitely meant it's not material. If it's not material, it's impossible to measure, because to measure, you want to have something which you can weigh, which, you know, it's extended in space, yeah? Which spiritual persons usually not. But you can measure behavior. You can measure behavior by observation, by doing tests, by doing statistics, and by seeing whether meaning is absent or present, and how this affects human behavior, or even human thought processes, feeling processes, and so on and so forth. David Goodman and me in 2006, we wanted to see whether logotherapy can stand up to the empirical challenge. And we went to PsycInfo, which is APA's, American Psychological Association's database of peer-reviewed published studies. And you might know this, that we found about 620. We expected to find about 10 or 20 or so, yeah? And wanted to write an article for the forum. In the end, it grew to a book of, I don't know, 300-something pages. In 2012, I was commissioned to write another article on what had happened in the meanwhile, because in 2006 we could, of course, only summarize studies for 30 years, ending in 2005. And as you see, there's been even more studies, I mean, relatively speaking, in a short time, supporting logotherapy. And yet, whatever these studies show, and they do confirm logotherapy on many different layers, yeah, if you are a strict hardcore reductionist, you could easily say that since what you're measuring is behavior, and what you're measuring is either test performance or whatever, but it is behavior. And behavior means you observe a moving body extended in space, very material. Yeah? You could say perhaps it's measurable and therefore reducible. Yeah? Now, if the frontal cortex really is what we believe to be a spiritual neurotic person, yeah, it's even easier. You can just reduce it right from the beginning. Yeah? And there we go. This is how it looks like. Yeah? According to reductionism. If you think this is complicated, I would just like to show you this one. This is Viktor Frankl's way of putting things. And by the way, this is just for historical reasons, because we recently found this. This is the first draft of dimensional ontology, which we found in the archives. Yeah. You see, he tried out different ideas on this, because you never find the thing about the figure. Anyway, so this is the challenge. And to be able to make some empirical predictions, you need to have logotherapy, or the idea of the neurotic person logotherapy, in a nutshell. And if you're looking for them in Frankl's work, you don't need to look far. There are two credos he proposed. Credos means I believe. I don't even know how familiar the Americans are with these credos. I think they are common knowledge, yeah? The psychotherapeutic credo? Okay, basically it tells us, and you don't need to read all of this, that we do have the ability to self-distance from the organism, under all conditions, he says, yeah? Under all conditions. And number two, the psychiatric credo is proposing that even in a comatose patient, in a demented patient, behind the face of the disorder, there is a person which is indestructible, undestructible, indestructible. You can't destroy it. Yeah. So these are two very, very strong predictions, and they, of course, stand in extreme stark contrast to the idea that the frontal cortex and the human person are one and the same. You can identify the two. Yeah? Are you still with me? Now, how do you test this? What do you do? Yeah? And here the challenge begins. Once again, you can't capture a spiritual person. You know who you are, but I mean, you can't publish a paper saying, I know who I am. You need some data. Yeah? Now, what you should do, or what I believe one could do or should do, is seek frontier situations, seek extreme situations, yeah? Extreme disorders or extreme conditions, yeah? In which you may find somehow the closely knit human structure, yeah? Spirit, mind, and body is somehow loosened. Yeah? You see what I mean? And then maybe you find some data which you can use for fine-grained analysis of human structure, of the human person, who we are again. Yeah? Okay, and be brave. This is number 4. Test the predictions of materialism versus dualism. Dualism, in the basic sense, means that there are two substances involved with us, not only matter but also something spiritual. Good. A perfect case, by coincidence, it came to my doorstep from a student who told me about this, is OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Yeah, obsessive-compulsive disorder is the idea. You know what it is. Yeah, it's people having ideas which they experience as being not their own. Yeah, at the same time they feel compelled, even coerced, to think or do certain rituals which they have the insight that they don't want it, and yet they have to do it. Yeah. In other words, you could also say, this is what the student told me: OCD kidnapped my will. Yeah. Now we're talking about free will, and the idea that if anywhere there should be freedom in this world, it must be with us, because only something which is not material can be unconditioned. You get what I mean? Yeah. Everything in physics is conditioned. Your brain is conditioned. There's a preceding event causing the present event, and so on. Yeah. For free will, this can't go, because the preceding event can't or should not determine this present event. Otherwise, you would have no choice, because your biology, whatever, would make your choices. Yeah. Okay. If you didn't understand this, it doesn't matter. I continue anyway, and you'll see. Wait a second. Okay. But since logotherapy says that not only do we have freedom, but we are freedom, yeah, and this identity between freedom and who we are means really the identity of freedom and the erratic person, yeah. It's the only thing in this world which we know, which can move freely between different choices and so on, yeah. OCD is the ideal case for this research project, yeah. Get why? Because it's really affected. The spiritual person is affected. Yeah. Okay. Good. And for a very long time, people thought Freud believed it was totally psychodynamic in origin. Frankl already sensed that there must be some brain events involved in OCD. Now we know it. Jeffrey Schwartz was at the UCLA and Scott Rauch in Boston. Really showed that there are mainly brain neuronal causes for OCD. Yeah, I'll spare you the details, but you see, if you look at these fancy pictures, you'll see that there are differences what is happening in our brains for OCD patients versus so-called normal patients. And I spare you this, but one even knows which areas of the brain are most likely to be involved or affected by OCD, not affected by, are causing OCD. Yeah? And it makes much sense why they do, but I spare you the details, and it's not so really good. Yeah? But here you see, and this is from Jeff Schwartz's lab at UCLA, here you see the normal mental activity of an OCD patient versus a normal patient. And you see that in the frontal cortex, the very area where it says that the human person resides, yeah, in the frontal cortex, you see abnormal activity. This is the glucose metabolism telling you the activity of the brain. Yeah. Good. So, if you take so we do have a good and clear case in favor of the human person, spiritual person, being strongly conditioned, perhaps even determined by a brain. I wouldn't say disorder, but by a disordered brain. Yeah. Now, if you take the psychotherapeutic credo, the idea that we can distance ourselves, that the spiritual person never becomes sick, but is affected by disorder and so on, yeah, And if you translate this to OCD research, you will say this. There's a difference between symptom and person, of course. The noetic cord can't fall ill, and therefore it can distance itself, because you need to be healthy to distance yourself from the disorder. Yeah? It's not free from the condition, and you all know this, but it's very free towards what it's doing with these conditions. Yeah? And point 5 is the essential point. Yeah? Is there causal efficacies? Is there causal action from soul to brain? In other words, from noetic person to the brain. Yeah? Now, this is the open question. And this would come very close to an empirical test of at least one portion of the psychotherapeutic credo. Now, Jeffrey Schwartz was the person who came up with a brilliant, easy program. He told his severely OCD disordered patients for 1 month, only for 1 month, do the following. When the obsession comes, so when such a strange idea comes that I have to wash my hands 100 times or whatever, yeah, relabel it. In other words, practice self-distancing. Say, it's not me, it's OCD. Yeah, it's a misfiring in my orbitofrontal cortex. It's in a certain brain area. Yeah, re-attribute. In other words, explain it to yourself. I feel an urge which is going against my will, and this is not my will, but it's a misfiring signal of my brain. Yeah, and then refocus. In other words, patients should say, I decide against this kidnapped will. Yeah, and I'm going to do what is meaningful. For example, I could either wash my hands and have some good, feeling good for 10 minutes until the next obsession comes. Yeah, or I do the needful. I see that there's some other need in the world next to how I feel at this moment, yeah, and I'll do it against the urge to do otherwise, against the urge to wash my hands or to rearrange certain things on the table, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and then if succeeded, revalue, have insight. So it worked, and the OCD patient won't be free by then. He'll still feel tension, nervousness, anxiety that something bad will happen. Yeah. But he will also feel that I did something meaningful. And as we know, happiness is a byproduct of having done something meaningful. So it will be a mixed state of tension and happiness. Yeah? Now, if you translate these 4 steps into logotherapy, I just said that you have 2 steps of self-distancing, 1 of self-transcendence, reaching out to something meaningful, and insight. These 3 properties or abilities are abilities of the human spirit. We know only of the human spirit. So there are 2 predictions one can make from this program as a study. Yeah? As a study means you have a control group who's doing usual CBT or taking SSRIs, medication for their OCD, or you have these 4 steps. Only following these 4 steps for about 1 month. You get what I'm saying? Good. Now, the soft prediction is all of this works. In other words, and working in this case means the symptoms really decline, or maybe persons are even symptom-free. Yeah, depending how you define symptom-free. They might still have obsessions, but they won't lose time by following them up. Yeah, a strong prediction, and this would be the prediction of the soul hypothesis. In other words, the noetic person hypothesis would be that these steps of self-distancing and self-transcendence and insight should also affect brain matter. They should causally interact with the cause of the disorder. Yeah? Now, the weak prediction is confirmed, and about 87% of the patients are symptom-free. Symptom-free again means they do still have strange ideas from time to time, and yet they accept them as background noise of the misfiring brain. It no longer affects them as deeply. Yeah, and I should add that 87% is a bit better than paradoxical intention, which usually goes around 75%. Yeah, perhaps you could even combine the 2 and reach 90 whatever %, but at least we know that these principles are working. Yeah, again, this has been studied with about 200 subjects, so it's a very good group. Yeah. So when we come to the psychotherapeutic credo, we can say, yes, there's a difference between symptom and person, otherwise it wouldn't be possible to self-distance. And the self-transcendence confirms number 4, people do really understand there's something more meaningful to do than to follow the commandments of a disordered brain. Yeah? The real question, the interesting question for us is about number 5. Yeah? Could you somehow detect the causal efficacy of self-distancing, self-transcendence, and insight on the human brain? And the answer is yes. And a very strong one, because what you see here is for one patient in this case who had severe therapy resistant, whatever, OCD for 20 years. Yeah? And after 4 weeks of treatment, you see that brain activity, and this is not only functional, this is really architectural, yeah? Brain activity in the orbital cortex, which is mainly involved in OCD, yeah? Is close to, if not normal. Yeah? Now, this study has been published in 1999 in the Journal of Clinical Neuropsychiatry, yeah? And as is usual in such articles, in the end you find a discussion section. And I'd like to point out, we don't have to read all of this, but I'd like to point out something which Jeffrey Schwartz wrote and which passed the peer reviewing process, which is incredible, yeah? He says, there's one key point, both clinically and philosophically. Again, you rarely find philosophy in the Journal of Clinical Neuropsychiatry, yeah? Is to comprehend that the conscious mind and the brain activity involve active processes. So, and he says as a mental force, yeah, overcoming meaningful behavior, it's the second last row, meaningful behavior, choosing, will be overcoming tremendous biological forces that are operating in order to resist that change. Yeah? You really have the divine power of the human spirit here. Yeah? Not only that, he says about this force, the mental force, yeah, it represents the essence of what the word active and purposeful, which is also the two defining properties of the human spirit. Active and purposeful really mean, in brief, these findings seem to tell us one thing, and you do so very clearly: you are not your brain. To have this published in the Journal of Clinical Neuropsychiatry, I think isn't it astonishing? I think one. Anyway, now there have been some replications of these studies in Vienna by PhD students. Anyway, I had the honor to supervise them on pure obsessive subtype OCD, which is different because it means that people don't do overt rituals, they don't do behavioral rituals, but they do mental rituals, yeah, which is much more difficult to reach by CBT, because CBT needs behavior to be cognitive behavioral therapy, but there is no behavior, no outward behavior for pure subtype OCD. Still, the same findings, the same results, the same declining overactivity in the frontal cortex. Another student of mine did it with social phobia, general anxiety disorder, is subtype borderline. So there are many different, very different brain circuits involved here, where you find we have the same finding. Self-distancing, self-transcendence after a very short time. In this case, it was 2 months, because we wanted to give the effect a chance. We find really how the mental attitude towards affects brain structure. Yeah? Okay, so number one, I should think these data do really support, I mean, in science everything is provisional, and there might come another study tomorrow, but maybe there come more studies in favor of this idea. The idea that we can self-distance under ordinary circumstance, yeah, and actively shape our mind and body seems to be fairly well confirmed, whatever, yeah. And for the first time, really for the first time, and Frankl believed we can do it. He observed it in his patients, yeah. Okay, you get. I hope you get the point, and I hope you get an idea how exciting this is, yeah. Now we come to the second and much more difficult and much more a credo, the psychiatric credo. The belief that within each of us there's a self, a noetic self, which can be disturbed but not destroyed. Yeah. Now to test this is much more difficult. Yeah. But once again, if you do this, go to the extreme method, to go to extreme measures. In other words, take extreme cases, those cases, perhaps which some of you have experienced with your patients or relatives, yeah, and which made you doubt, is there really a spiritual person? I remember Polish student of mine who wrote a very moving paper. She's a psychiatrist, and she did a PhD with us, and she wrote a paper, Where is my patient? And she had a brilliant young man, who was slightly psychotic, and she said, look, and she thought how beautiful this person is behind the disorder, but then he went into full psychosis, and he seemed to be gone, and so where did this patient go? That's a good question, The same question may arise for dementia, and more especially for Alzheimer's disease, and of course for death, because death is the ultimate condition of our brain. Now, psychosis, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and you know where I'm heading at, are perhaps represent perhaps the strongest form of the determination, physiological determination for our thought processes, our thinking, our choice, and so on and so forth. And death, of course, is defined. In patients, for those of you who have never seen Alzheimer's patients, they might really change very much. I mean, they become aggressively, but it's not only that they lose certain facilities, they really change to the core. Very peaceful persons might become very violent, aggressive, bizarre, disinhibited, and so on, especially if you have frontal dementia. So, and of course, death is the ultimate condition, I said so already. And there are really two views on this, and I must say, if you look in Frankl's own books, you also find the two views are confirmed, or at least he talks about them. It's either the strongest form of brain determinism, because it decides whether you exist or not exist, whether there's someone there or not, or it might be the strongest form of self-distancing. In other words, this whole somehow distancing yourself from the body, or the body from the soul. Now, to show to you what we are talking about, here you have the comparison between a so-called normal or healthy brain and the brain in advanced Alzheimer's disease. It really shrinks. It's like eating through from the outside to the inside. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross, who some of you might know as the founding father of psychology for the dying, who also did some research on dying patients, and then she found out that some of these patients, when they are revived, anyway, when they're revived, they do claim to experience different things. I just went to Barnes & Noble yesterday, and I saw that there's a bestseller, obviously, in the States called what? Proof of Heaven. Yeah. So near-death experiences, in other words, are sometimes used. I'm not going to go into this, though I should point out that Crumbo, the author of this paper was shown, Crumbo Noholic, I recently found out, wrote a brilliant paper on near-death experiences in logotherapy, not in our circle, but there's an international association for near-death studies in California. And he wrote a paper on near-death experiences and how they relate to logotherapy. So someone else already took up this trace, and I think it's worthwhile going on research. Still, I'm not talking about this. I mentioned Kübler-Ross because Kübler-Ross also said that she observed something strange. In some of her patients who were severely demented, shortly before they died, there was lucidity. People who were psychotic or, again, demented, or had brain tumors and very different conditions, somehow seem to wake up, and say thank you to the nurse, or goodbye to the family, or say a prayer before they go, and so on. But Kübler-Ross, if you know her, if you know her writings, she was a brilliant mind, but she wasn't a very scientific mind. In other words, she reported this, but she never followed it, she never published data, and so on. But still, this is a trace, this is something which is worthwhile following. And the idea behind this is, perhaps something happens. It's not a necessary prediction within logotherapy, but it's something which is at least possible, if not likely. Perhaps something happens in the very small time window, in the process of dying. And I'm not talking about near-death experiences again. In the process of dying, which is unexpected, in other words, unpredicted by materialism, which tells us that you need brain tissue to function, But look at the brain tissue of an Alzheimer's disease patient, Yet it might be predicted, these strange phenomena, from the viewpoint of personalism or logotherapy or non-reductionism of the human person. So I thought for a long time, and then recently, 2 years ago, a friend of mine, Michael Nahm, who is a biologist in Freiburg University, published, together with Bruce Grayson, who is at the University of Virginia in the Division of Perceptual Studies, this paper. It's called Terminal Lucidity. Terminal means close to death, and lucidity means to be lucid, to be clear, to be aware, awake. In patients with chronic schizophrenia and dementia. It went on. Then he published, and in the beginning he looked through the literature, and found scattered in literature, different places, because no doctor yet, wrote a paper on this phenomenon. But very often you'll find in biographies of doctors or of nurses or in the hospice movement that, I will never forget this patient. He was totally demented for the past 10 years. You had to feed him because he wasn't even able to know that food belongs to him. So he was really demented, and then suddenly he woke up. He was clear. He talked to me. He said, "Thank you. I felt so tired for the past 10 years," or whatever, and then dies. Now this is unpredicted, and it's almost impossible, according to strict brain-mind determinism, brain-spirit determinism. So in the beginning, Michael Nahm was collecting these from about 100 years of literature. He was collecting these papers, these things, and he made a survey of the literature. Once he published this, people came forward and wrote to him, people with the hospices, the nurses, and they said, "Look, you don't need to look so far 100 years ago. This happened to us last week, last month," and so on. I don't want to make too much of this, and yet I don't want to make too little of it. Because this comes very close to what the psychiatric credo would predict, that perhaps, and now I have to widely speculate, perhaps at the process of dying, which is a special process anyway, perhaps this is the time when the tight joining together of spirit, mind, and body dissolves, But instead of a total dissolution, what you find is that it's almost like a liberation. This is how the nurses describe it. Now Sir Peter Fenwick of the Royal Society of Medicine in London, and we in Vienna, we made a replication of this in so far. Replication means that we ask nurses and doctors, and also looked at something which is important. We looked at potential medical factors which might be the cause or reason why there's a sudden lucidity. This wouldn't explain so much for Alzheimer's disease. Again, it's a really severely affected brain. There have been patients who had brain tumors which were big as golf balls or apples, and it's hard to explain anyway. But still, we wanted to look because some of you might know that Wagner Jauregg in Austria discovered that his schizophrenic patients, some of them got clearer. At least not totally healthy, but clearer, when they had fever. Because indeed there was a certain type of schizophrenia which we don't know no longer because it's so easily treated, which is like an infection, and fever kills the bacterium, and therefore people regain consciousness. Again, this is just functional with fever. It's not possible in this case because we are talking about a almost destroyed brain. If you look at Alzheimer's disease's brain, it's really gone, so the important areas are gone. So we asked about medical factors nonetheless, and there was no correlation, not a confounding factor. So people having eaten, not eaten, whether fever, not fever, heart condition, not heart condition, diabetes, whatever it was, there was no strong correlation between any medical condition and terminal lucidity. Neither was age group a factor, but of course we had an presence of elderly people with Alzheimer's. Now, 77 and 82%, it's altogether, Peter's study, having a bit more now, reported one or more such incidents in a 1 year time span. Again, no correlation with other factors other than impending death, because it's terminal lucidity, which means that death is a very confounding factor. Okay, these are numbers, and I would like to show you what one nurse wrote, and it's very representative of what other nurses said. Yeah. Before this happened, this meaning it's a young nurse observing a patient of whom she thought is just a human vegetable, as we say in German, perhaps also in English. I cared for. Now I understand that I'm caring for nurslings of immortality. I know I can't prove this to you, but had you seen what I saw, you would understand that the brain disorder can affect the soul, but it cannot destroy it. Now, this nurse didn't know that we were logotherapy. Well, I'm also doing logotherapy. We did it from the cognitive science department, so there was no impression management. Yeah, I only wish I would have known this earlier. Now, a brain disorder can affect the soul of the neurotic person, but it cannot destroy it, which is exactly what the psychiatric credo is telling us. Yeah, the neurotic person is disturbable, but not destroyable. You can't destroy it. So, as far as evidence goes, again, we are talking about an area where it's very hard to get evidence, yeah? And still, it's an area where you can make some predictions and be happily surprised if the predictions are confirmed. So, it seems to be that we can also affirm the psychiatric credo as far as it goes. Yeah? So, I'm closing now, a bit late, but still I'm doing it. I told you in the beginning that there's been a long journey in the history of the behavioral sciences. Yeah? We ended up with the brain. I would like to say this is a contemporary challenge. And I also would like to say the growth of logotherapy, the inner growth of logotherapy, yeah, really depends on how willing and able we are to confront these issues. And I can tell you it's an extremely rewarding experience. To begin with, when David and me wanted to publish this article in the forum, and in the end it was a book on how many studies there are, and then to go into this field of dementia research and terminal lucidity, or the OCD cases, all of this really pointing to the fact that it seems as if, and this is one of my students telling this, it seems as if we can lose everything, but not ourselves. Yeah. Which is a wonderful message. So, and this leads us back to the unconditional man. And thank you very much for your patience.